Welcome to VSOW. We've just finished digging through, well, quite a stack of sources today. We're talking detailed reports, research papers, some pretty deep macroeconomic analyses. And they all seem to be painting this picture, a picture of converging systemic risks. So our mission today is really to cut through all that complexity and give you the critical, synthesized knowledge you need to, well, understand what's potentially coming down the pike.
That's right. And these sources are, frankly, quite sobering because they're not just talking about isolated problems here and there. They're really highlighting this concerning convergence, economic vulnerabilities, political ones, environmental threats, all potentially hitting at once. We're looking at everything from, immediate financial dangers, disruptions to global trade, right through to democratic erosion and, well, the big one, existential climate threats. So we're going to dissect this material rigorously. We'll analyze the potential consequences and, importantly, the actions that the experts behind these reports are suggesting.
Okay, so we've structured this deep dive around three main areas of fragility that just kept popping up in the data. First, those immediate financial shocks, things impacting your wallet and the national budget right now. Second, the longer-term, frankly, catastrophic environmental costs that seem to be accelerating. And finally, the internal issues, the structural, social, and political fractures that might be stopping us from tackling the first two effectively.
Exactly. And given the gravity of all this and how interconnected it is, we'll maintain a formal interview tone. We really want to synthesize these findings meticulously. Our goal is to provide you, the listener, with comprehensive, actionable knowledge that respects the complexity and, frankly, the high stakes involved here, so you can be fully informed.
Right, let's dive into those immediate threats then. The first shockwave that jumps out from the sources is, well, economic policy, specifically around trade. One analysis we looked at highlights that the recent tariff spree marks the largest tax increase for U.S. taxpayers in, I think it said, more than a generation. That's a huge claim.
It is, but according to the data in these reports, it's accurate. And understanding the scale here is really fundamental to grasping the disruption. We're talking about effective tariff rates. That's the average tariff on all imports. The sources show they're now sitting at around 25%. 25%. Now, to give you some context on that number, for most of the last 50 years, U.S. effective tariff rates were, below 4%. They were only 2.3% at the end of the previous administration. So 25% is, well, it's an order of magnitude higher, a really significant immediate economic shock.
Okay, 25%. And this isn't just some abstract economic number, right? You mentioned it's the largest tax increase. How did that actually hit, say, the typical American household budget?
Well, it translates into a pretty substantial immediate hit through higher prices, basically a consumption tax increase. Researchers have tried to quantify this. Estimates for the short-run cost for a typical household, and this includes the way tariffs push up prices on domestic goods, too. They range somewhere between $3,100 and $4,900 per year. And what's really striking, according to one analysis, is just how big that burden is relative to other taxes. For someone earning the median income, this annual tariff cost could potentially be larger than their entire federal income tax bill.
Larger than their income tax. Wow. So think about that money. That's like, what, a huge chunk of rent or mortgage payments for the year?
Exactly. Or maybe a whole year's worth of property taxes for some. It's a significant amount of money basically erased from a household's budget because of this one policy area. It's not abstract at all.
And that really underscores this idea of a fiscal switch you mentioned, moving the tax burden from income, maybe, towards consumption. The sources seem to emphasize this policy is regressive. Why is it hitting lower-income Americans harder?
Yeah, that regressivity is a really crucial point the sources make, both for fairness and economic stability. Tariffs are, at their core, consumption taxes. They tax the stuff we buy. Now, higher income individuals, they tend to save a larger portion of their income, right? And savings aren't hit by tariffs. But lower income individuals, they often have to spend pretty much everything they earn just on necessities: food, clothes, housing, transport. So that tariff burden eats up a much, much larger percentage of their income after taxes.
So the effective tax rate from tariffs is much higher at the bottom.
Precisely. One analysis showed that for the lowest income group, these tariffs could cost them over 5% of their after-tax income. Meanwhile, for the top income group, especially if you factor in other tax changes like income tax cuts they might benefit more from, the net effect could be neutral or maybe even slightly positive. So it's actively shifting the tax burden downwards onto those who can least afford it.
Which kind of undermines any argument about economic revitalization for everyone, doesn't it? What about businesses? What are the consequences for U.S. firms, for competitiveness, for job creation? The usual argument is these tariffs protect domestic industry.
Well, the sources we reviewed strongly suggest the net effect is actually the opposite. They tend to be harmful, on balance, for U.S. job creation and competitiveness. You have to remember, in today's really complex global economy, a huge chunk of U.S. imports aren't finished goods like, TVs or shirts. A majority are actually intermediate goods. Things like components, specialized parts, machinery, raw materials, stuff that U.S. manufacturers need to make their final products.
Ah, okay. So tariffs on those inputs just raise costs for American companies.
Exactly. It makes U.S. producers operate with artificially higher costs. That makes them less competitive compared to companies in other countries that don't face these tariffs on their inputs. We saw this play out quite clearly in studies of earlier tariffs, like the steel tariffs a few years back. Any job gains in the steel production sector itself were, well, they were quickly overwhelmed by job losses in industries that use steel. Think auto parts, construction, heavy machinery. Their costs went way up.
And then there's retaliation, right?
Yes, that's the other side of it. U.S. exporters get hit too, not just by rising input costs making their products more expensive, but also when other countries hit back with their own counter tariffs on U.S. goods. That cuts off market access abroad. So overall, the data suggests it's a net loss for U.S. economic activity and jobs.
Okay, and all this feeds into broader macroeconomic instability. You mentioned stagflation earlier.
It does, yeah. That's the big risk highlighted. Stagflation, that nasty combination of rising prices, so inflation and slowing economic growth, stagnation or even recession. Major forecasters, institutions like Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, they've explicitly cited tariffs as a key reason for lowering their U.S. GDP growth forecasts and significantly raising the probability of a U.S. recession. Prices go up because of the import taxes, but the economy slows down because businesses face higher costs, become less competitive, less profitable, and consumers have less purchasing power.
Which creates a nightmare for the central bank, right?
Yeah.
For the Federal Reserve.
Oh, absolutely. Think about their dilemma. Their main job is fighting inflation, which usually means tightening policy, raising interest rates. But tariffs are simultaneously pushing the economy towards a recession, which normally calls for loosening policy, cutting rates to boost activity. It's like, being forced to slam on the brakes and the accelerator at the same time. The sources suggest this stagflationary pressure really limits the Fed's ability to stabilize things effectively. It increases the chances of either a drawn-out recession or stubbornly high inflation, or maybe even both. Hashtag tag 1.2, the ticking time bomb of U.S. debt refinancing.
Okay, so that's one immediate shock, the tariff situation, but it's playing out alongside something else the sources are really flagging, what some call a ticking time bomb with U.S. debt. Specifically, this massive amount of debt that needs refinancing soon, particularly in 2025, and this apparently stems from political choices made quite a while ago.
Yes. This is arguably one of the most concerning financial vulnerabilities discussed, partly because it's, self-inflicted. It comes directly from this long-term strategy, or maybe lack of strategy, where politicians consistently opted for short-term debt instead of locking in longer-term financing. Why do that? Well, short-term interest rates are usually lower initially, so it makes the current budget deficit look a bit smaller, which is, politically convenient in the short run.
But it creates a huge risk down the line.
A massive rollover risk.
Yeah.
It means you constantly have to go back to the market to refinance huge chunks of debt as they mature. And in 2025 alone, the sources estimate that roughly 30%, nearly a third of all outstanding U.S. national debt, is coming due and needs to be refinanced.
30% of the entire national debt in 1 year.
Yeah.
Can we put a dollar figure on that? How much are we talking about?
We are talking about approximately $10 trillion. And just to give that number some historical perspective, which really underlines how serious this is, $10 trillion was the total U.S. national debt less than 15 years ago.
The whole debt burden back then is now coming due in a single year.
That's what the analysis suggests. That entire sum, which seemed mind-bogglingly large not so long ago, now represents the amount that needs to be rolled over in just a 12-month period. That's the maturity wall everyone's talking about.
And the timing couldn't be worse because interest rates now are much higher than when a lot of that debt was first issued. You mentioned rates have basically doubled.
That's the absolute core of the problem. Interest rates have shot up globally, partly driven by the need to fight inflation, which itself was fueled by, huge deficits, and the debt itself, ironically.
Yeah.
So the cost of refinancing that $10 trillion wall at today's much higher rates is just Monumental. Even conservative estimates are suggesting that the annual interest payment alone on the national debt could soar past $1.3 trillion in 2025.
$1.3 trillion just in interest payments. Again, that number is so huge it's hard to grasp. How does that compare to other major government spending?
It represents an extraordinary crowding out effect, what economists call fiscal displacement. It squeezes almost everything else the government does. So let's try to contextualize $1.3 trillion. It's more than the government spends on, say, major defense programs. It's more than the entire cost of Medicaid. It's getting close to being as large as the single biggest existing government payment, which is Social Security for retirees. Think about funding, I don't know, NASA, the entire Department of Energy, the FBI, all federal funding for K-12 education combined. You still wouldn't reach $1.3 trillion.
So when interest payments get that big, the government basically has to borrow even more just to pay the interest and fund existing services.
That's the trap. It becomes a vicious, self-reinforcing debt spiral.
Huh.
You're borrowing more just to tread water, making the underlying problem even worse over time.
This makes me think about the difference between normal economic cycles, recessions, and these deeper long-term debt cycles that some economists write about.
Yes, exactly. The sources do reference economists who study these things. These long-term debt cycles, like the ones that maybe preceded the Great Depression, happen when total debt levels, public and private, become so overwhelmingly large that the cost of just servicing that debt starts to choke off real economic activity. But what makes the current situation potentially unique, or at least very different from the last major crisis, is the contrast with 2008.
Right. How is this different from the 2008 financial crisis?
Well, in 2008, the crisis was fundamentally driven by the private sector, wasn't it? It was banks, homeowners, corporations holding way too much debt, too much leverage. The government then stepped in with bailouts, asset purchases, effectively transferring huge amounts of that private sector debt onto the public balance sheet. The government socialized the losses, so to speak.
Okay, so if a crisis is triggered this time by this $10 trillion refinancing wall, it's not starting in the private sector. It's starting with the government itself potentially struggling to manage its own debt.
Precisely. The risk this time, if this debt cycle turns downwards, is more of a sovereign debt crisis, a government problem. And that's especially destabilizing because the U.S. issues the world's reserve currency, the dollar. If global markets start to seriously doubt the U.S. government's ability to comfortably service its debt, confidence in the dollar itself could erode very quickly. That has massive global implications, potentially drying up credit worldwide.
That sounds incredibly serious. Is there any way out being discussed?
Well, one rather chilling possibility hinted at in some analyses is whether policymakers might feel forced to deliberately engineer a recession sooner rather than later. The thinking would be to try and crush demand, bring down inflation quickly, and force interest rates lower before that $10 trillion wall hits in 2025, making the refinancing slightly less catastrophically expensive. But that's obviously a massive gamble with huge economic pain involved.
Okay, so we've got this immediate financial instability brewing. But let's shift focus now to the slower-moving crisis that the sources argue makes all this short-term fragility even more dangerous in the long run. That's the cost of climate inaction. We're looking now at the profound long-term economic and human costs, particularly highlighted in things like the Joint Economic Committee report.
Yeah, this threat might unfold more slowly than a financial crash, but the consequences are arguably even more profound, potentially existential for global stability. And the sources are very clear in quantifying the economic devastation. They show that failing to act decisively on climate change will be catastrophic, mainly by slowing down productivity growth right across the economy, permanently. The estimates are pretty stark. Even what seems like modest warming, say 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, is estimated by economists to shave about 0.5% off U.S. GDP every single year.
0.5% annually. That really adds up over time.
It compounds dramatically. And if warming reaches 4 degrees Celsius, which is within the realm of possibility on current trajectories, that GDP loss estimate jumps to a staggering 2.0% annually, year after year after year. Hundreds of billions, eventually trillions, in lost output.
That's a huge drag on future prosperity. How does it actually impact the economy day to day? You mentioned productivity. How does something like extreme heat, for example, actually slow things down?
Right. Extreme heat is one of the most direct impacts, and it weakens the economy through two main channels that are well documented now. The first is simply reduced labor supply. This mostly hits outdoor industries, think construction, agriculture, utilities, landscaping. Research finds that when temperatures get really high, say over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the amount of time workers can safely and effectively work drops significantly, sometimes by as much as an hour per day per worker.
Okay, so people literally work less. What's the second channel? Does it affect indoor workers too?
It does,
Hmm.
surprisingly. The second channel is lower productivity during working hours, even for people who aren't directly exposed to the heat. Studies looking at the manufacturing sector, for instance, like the auto industry, they found measurable drops in factory output. Output declined by about 8% in weeks where there were 6 or more days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And this was even in factories that had air conditioning.
Even with AC, so it's not just about being physically hot, it affects concentration or something.
It seems so. It suggests there's a broader physiological stress or general inefficiency that kicks in when it's persistently hot outside, affecting cognitive function, focus, maybe even equipment function in some cases. It permeates the economic structure.
And did the sources try to put a dollar figure on the lost wages just from people avoiding heat?
They did. One study estimated as much as $80 billion per year in lost wages just from time lost, avoiding extreme heat. And that was only looking at a few highly exposed industries, so the total economy-wide cost is likely much higher. And beyond wages, the financial system itself is getting increasingly worried. We hear a lot about property loss risks, trillions in coastal home values exposed to sea level rise and storms. But now, these second-order effects are hitting municipal finance. Credit rating agencies are starting to downgrade or flag risks for local governments whose tax base relies heavily on climate-exposed properties.
Ah, so if people leave coastal areas or flood zones, the local government loses property tax revenue.
Exactly. And that directly impacts the value and safety of the municipal bonds those towns and cities issue. And those bonds are held everywhere in retirement accounts, pension funds, by individual savers. So the financial risk is spreading far beyond the actual physical locations being hit by climate impacts. Hashtag tag 2.2 social health at disproportionate human costs.
Okay, let's pivot from the purely economic costs, though they are huge, to the human costs. The sources really stress that these are arguably much higher, even if they're harder to put a precise dollar figure on, and they drive the urgency.
Absolutely. The human dimension is critical. We can start with the direct health impacts. Extreme weather events, especially heat waves, are directly linked to increased mortality, people dying from heat stroke, cardiovascular stress. But it goes beyond direct deaths. Things like decreased outdoor activity because it's just too hot or the air quality is too poor, that's linked to higher rates of obesity, hypertension, other chronic conditions. And we can't separate climate change from the pollution caused by burning fossil fuels. That particulate pollution is estimated to cause thousands of premature deaths every year, plus widespread respiratory issues like asthma.
And the sources also mention some surprising ripple effects across society, things like crime rates.
Yes, this is where the science, particularly what's called attribution science, has advanced quite a bit. Researchers are getting much better at identifying these seemingly indirect effects and showing statistically significant causal links. For instance, multiple studies now show a reliable link between higher temperatures and increases in violent crime rates. Some even suggest links to broader civil unrest, basically. Societal stress just boils over more easily in extreme heat. And another really concerning one, children's learning suffers. Just like worker productivity drops, student concentration and learning outcomes decline when classrooms are too hot, which many are, especially in older schools or poorer districts lacking good AC.
So kids literally can't learn as well for potentially months out of the year. The long-term impact of that must be enormous.
Immense. It impacts human capital formation for a whole generation. And a crucial point running through all the sources is that these costs, these impacts, they're not distributed evenly. They fall disproportionately on already marginalized and low-income communities.
Right, amplifying existing inequalities. How does that play out specifically?
The data is pretty sharp here. For example, studies show African Americans are about 40% more likely to live in areas projected to have the greatest increases in mortality risk due to climate change effects, like extreme heat. They're also significantly more likely, about 34% more likely, to live in areas with the highest predicted increases in childhood asthma rates, often due to living near polluting infrastructure or in urban heat islands where pavement traps heat.
And what about other groups? You mentioned earnings risk earlier.
Yes, Hispanic and Latino Americans face a higher risk to their earnings, primarily because they are disproportionately represented in those weather-exposed industries like agriculture and construction, where heat impacts labor supply directly. And more broadly, when the EPA looked at 6 major categories of climate impacts, things like health, property, energy cost, they found that low-income Americans were at higher risk in at least 5 out of the 6 categories. They simply have fewer resources to adapt. They can't easily move or afford better insulation or air conditioning or absorb income shocks. It traps them in a cycle of increasing vulnerability. Hashtag 2.3, the rising cost of inaction versus the falling cost of action.
Okay, so the picture painted of the costs of inaction is, frankly, pretty grim, dire even. But the sources do offer a significant silver lining, a counterpoint here. It seems to be this stark contrast. The cost of doing nothing about climate change is absolutely soaring, while the cost of actually doing something, taking action, is falling rapidly.
That's a really important dynamic. The escalating cost of damage is probably best captured by something called the social cost of carbon, the SEC. This is economists' best attempt to estimate all the future economic damages. Health costs, property damage, agricultural losses, everything caused by emitting 1 additional ton of carbon dioxide today.
Yeah.
And over the last decade or so, the official and academic estimates for the SEC have just exploded upwards. Depending on the methodology, the increase is somewhere between 125% and over 600%.
Wow, why such a massive jump in the estimated cost? Are the damages just getting worse faster than we thought?
It's largely down to two things, really. First, just better economic modeling, incorporating more feedback loops and risks. But second, and perhaps more importantly, it's that advancement in attribution science we mentioned. Scientists can now link climate change much more confidently and directly to specific extreme weather events. They can say, climate change made this particular hurricane 20% wetter, or it made this heat wave 50 times more likely. That means climate change is demonstrably responsible for a much larger share of the real-world damages than we previously accounted for.
So the calculated cost per ton of CO2 goes way up because we can now prove it caused more of the damage we're seeing.
Exactly. And we see these costs hitting in the real world already. Think about the Texas deep freeze event a few years ago that cost the state's economy somewhere up to $130 billion. Or look at California, where a single utility company is spending something like $15 billion just trying to upgrade its grid to prevent catastrophic wildfires. Wildfires made far more frequent and intense by climate-driven drought and heat. The cost of inaction is becoming very real very quickly.
Okay, so the price tag for doing nothing is skyrocketing. What about the other side of the equation? The cost of solutions. That's where the good news is.
That really is the remarkable story here. The cost of preventing emissions, of switching to clean energy, has just plummeted. It's a genuine technological revolution driven by market forces and policy support. Look at solar power. The amount of solar generating capacity installed has grown something like 42% per year on average over the last decade. It's now often cheaper to build new solar than to keep running old coal or even gas plants in many places. And costs are still forecast to fall further.
And it's not just solar, right? Batteries are key too.
Absolutely critical. Energy storage, mainly lithium-ion batteries, has seen an even more dramatic cost decline, something like 97% cheaper over the last 30 years. That exponential drop is what has completely transformed transportation. Think about electric vehicles, EVs. A decade ago, they were maybe niche, expensive, limited range. Now, thanks to cheap batteries, you have EVs across all segments, cars, SUVs, even trucks. They often have better acceleration, more than enough range for daily commutes for most people, and crucially, much lower running costs, fuel and maintenance.
So the sources are basically saying the transition away from fossil fuels isn't just necessary, it's increasingly affordable, maybe even economically advantageous.
That's the argument, that investing in clean energy, energy efficiency, electrification, it's not just about avoiding future damages anymore. It's becoming a productive investment in its own right, creating jobs and potentially boosting competitiveness. The economic case for action is getting stronger every year, while the cost of inaction becomes unbearable.
Okay, let's shift gears now to the third major area of fragility identified in the sources, the internal threats. These are the political and social weaknesses that seem to be actively hindering our ability to deal with those huge financial and environmental challenges we just discussed. First up is political polarization. The sources argue this isn't just, healthy disagreement anymore. It's becoming something corrosive, actively eroding the system itself.
Yeah, the research on polarized democracies globally paints a pretty chilling picture here.
Yeah.
It draws a distinction between healthy political competition and what they call pernicious polarization. In a functioning democracy, you have political adversaries. They disagree, they argue fiercely, maybe they don't like each other much, but they fundamentally accept the legitimacy of the other side and the rules of the game. But in deeply polarized systems, that shifts. The opposition starts to be seen not just as wrong, but as an enemy, an existential threat that needs to be vanquished.
An enemy? That sounds like a complete breakdown of democratic norms.
It is. The dynamic shifts towards a kind of tribal struggle. Distrust and outright enmity just grow and grow. Citizens start to feel like, if the other side wins, I lose everything. Tolerance for bending or breaking democratic rules increases as long as it helps your side win or stops the enemy.
What drives this dangerous shift? What turns adversaries into enemies, according to the research?
The research usually points to three key factors, often working together. The first is politicians who actively divide. Leaders who deliberately exploit real grievances, maybe unemployment or crime fears or sometimes even manufacture threats. Calling refugees an invading army or something similar. The goal is to create a really sharp us versus them divide, often using identity politics as a wedge.
Okay, so leaders fanning the flames. What's the second factor?
The second is the opposition's reaction. How does the side being attacked respond? If they retaliate with the same level of bitter rhetoric, the same kind of whatever it takes hardball tactics, then they basically lock in this downward spiral of mutual escalation and distrust.
So it takes two to tango in a bad way.
In a sense, yes. And this cycle becomes especially hard to break. This is the third factor, when the polarization gets tangled up with deep, unresolved, polarizing rifts. These are often foundational debates, maybe going back to a country's founding, about national identity, who belongs, citizenship rights, things like the historical legacy of slavery and unequal rights for African Americans in the U.S., or ongoing debates about immigration and national identity in many Western countries. When polarization taps into those deep historical wounds, it becomes incredibly potent and persistent.
And what does this do psychologically to voters? Why is it so hard to reverse once it takes hold?
Well, once people start to feel that deep psychological divide, that us versus them mentality, it's really tough to pull back. Polarization tends to reward the extremes. Moderate voices, people trying to find common ground, they often get squeezed out, labeled as traitors or sellouts by their own side. And then there's this cognitive bias called motivated reasoning that kicks in strongly. Our existing beliefs, our emotions, our tribal loyalties, they heavily influence how we process new information. We tend to instantly accept information that confirms our side's views and fiercely reject facts that challenge them, even if the facts are solid. This makes people highly susceptible to misinformation, conspiracy theories, and just rejecting reality when it's inconvenient for their side. Hashtag 3.2, the systemic failure of welfare states in crisis.
Okay, so this political gridlock and hostility must impact how well the government functions, especially when a major crisis hits, right? Like a pandemic or a big recession. There was some interesting research, I think, from MIT comparing how different types of welfare states handled recent crises.
Yes, that research was quite revealing. It contrasted what political scientists call liberal welfare regimes, think the US, UK, Australia, Canada, maybe, with social democratic regimes, like the Scandinavian countries. Liberal regimes typically aim for minimal government intervention in normal times. Assistance is often targeted, means-tested, seen as a last resort. The core philosophy is individual responsibility for managing risk. Social democratic regimes, on the other hand, have much more comprehensive universal welfare systems, built-in extensive unemployment benefits, healthcare, family support as a core part of the system, always operating.
Right. But the irony highlighted was that when a big crisis hit, like COVID-19, it was actually the small government liberal regimes that suddenly unleashed absolutely massive, historically unprecedented amounts of emergency aid stimulus checks. Huge boost to unemployment benefits, business support.
Exactly. That's the mismatch irony they described. Suddenly, these systems that normally resist large-scale government spending deployed enormous sums, often with broad political support because it was an emergency. But the key point the research makes is that this aid is almost always designed to be temporary. It's an emergency patch designed to fade away as soon as the immediate crisis passes. So the underlying weak infrastructure never gets fixed or built upon. It just perpetuates this cycle of lurching from crisis to crisis with inefficient temporary band-aids.
So the argument is basically that the idea that keeping government small saves money is kind of an illusion, because you end up paying more inefficiently when the inevitable crisis hits.
That's the core argument. The lack of sustained investment in building capable government infrastructure, robust IT systems, effective delivery mechanisms, integrated data, it really backfires when a major shock occurs. You end up with clumsy, inefficient, sometimes regressive temporary fixes being thrown together in a panic. Compare the U.S. response to COVID aid delivery with, say, Denmark. Denmark already had robust systems linking employment, income, and family data. They could target aid much more quickly and precisely with less fraud. The U.S., lacking that integrated infrastructure, had to basically invent huge programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, from scratch, almost overnight. That led to enormous waste, fraud, and difficulty getting aid to those who needed it most efficiently.
So the cost wasn't really saved, it was just deferred and then amplified during the emergency, like paying extra for brush delivery on something you should have ordered ages ago.
That's a great analogy. You pay a premium for the lack of preparedness. The sources argue this shows that investing in capable, resilient public systems isn't just spending, it's actually a crucial investment in national resilience for the inevitable shocks to come. Hashtag 3.3, concentrated power and wealth inequality.
Okay, this connects to the final structural issue raised in the sources, which really tries to tie the political fragility and the financial strains together. This is the argument about concentrated power, particularly corporate and billionaire influence, actively working to undermine public systems for private gain. Some of the sources were quite forceful on this point.
They were indeed. The argument presented in some of these materials is that there's a deliberate effort underway to funnel tax dollars away from public goods and towards private enrichment. That concentrated wealth and power are actively working to, in their words, collapse public systems. One really contentious example they cite repeatedly is Social Security. The claim is that cuts are being pushed not just for actuarial reasons, but with the deliberate long-term goal of making the public system appear unsustainable, so that it eventually implodes or is drastically scaled back. And the endgame there, according to this analysis, is privatization. That's the claim. The expectation outlined is that if the public system is sufficiently weakened, private financial corporations, who, the sources note, often donate heavily to the politicians pushing for cuts, will then step in to offer private retirement accounts and annuities, effectively turning Social Security from a universal, not-for-profit social insurance system into a profit-driven private market commodity.
Now, hold on, isn't that framing a bit, well, extreme? I mean, aren't there genuine debates among economists across the spectrum about Social Security's long-term finances and solvency after, say, 2035? Are these sources saying that's all just manufactured?
That's a fair question and an important clarification. The sources presuming this argument generally acknowledge the existence of those long-term actuarial projections and the solvency concerns. However, their focus is on the political choices being made today in response to those projections. Their argument is that lawmakers who are heavily funded by the financial industry, an industry that stands to gain massively from privatization, are deliberately choosing to ignore relatively simple, viable fixes. Fixes like, for example, modestly raising or eliminating the cap on income subject to Social Security taxes, which many analyses show could largely resolve the projected shortfall. Instead, the argument goes, these lawmakers focus solely on benefit cuts, which inevitably weakens public trust and the system's perceived viability, thereby paving the path for privatization advocates. So it's framed less as a purely manufactured crisis and more as a deliberate political strategy to exploit a real challenge for private profit.
Okay, that clarifies the argument's nuance. So if this concentration of wealth and power is happening, how does it actually affect ordinary people's lives? How does it impact access to basic resources?
Well, the sources argue it creates this massive ongoing process of resource consolidation. Wealthy individuals and large corporations use their vast capital to buy up essential assets, often paying in cash, which drives up prices and consolidates control. We see concrete examples cited across different sectors. Things like large institutional investors buying up huge numbers of single-family homes, turning them into rentals, which pushes up both house prices and rents for everyone else. Or the systematic buying up of farmland by investment funds or billionaires, displacing smaller family farms and concentrating control over the food supply. And it extends even more locally, buying up mobile home parks, local medical clinics, utilities, even essential resources like water rights in drought-stricken areas.
And once they own these assets?
Once control is consolidated, the pattern described is often the same. Raise prices, cut services or staff to maximize profits, leaving local residents with fewer choices and higher costs for essential needs. It becomes harder for ordinary people to afford housing, healthcare, even water in some cases.
And this cycle even affects pathways to opportunity, like education.
It does. The sources describe this feedback loop where, for example, wealthy families might make large donations that help secure spots for their children at elite universities. At the same time, political pressure, sometimes funded by the same wealthy interests, pushes to divert public tax dollars away from public schools and towards private education options, maybe through voucher programs or tax credits. The net effect, the argument goes, is that it systematically disadvantages children from non-wealthy backgrounds, locking them out of opportunities and reinforcing that inequality across generations. It paints a picture of an emerging oligarchy controlling access to almost everything.
So We've covered a lot of ground here, weaving together these three major threads from the sources. First, the immediate threat of financial insolvency driven by this huge debt overhang and disruptive policies like tariffs. Second, the accelerating, potentially existential threat from climate damage with its soaring costs. And third, this internal decay, the extreme political polarization and the erosion of public systems seemingly driven by concentrated wealth and power. It's a profoundly daunting picture, especially when you think about that debt wall hitting potentially right at a peak of political dysfunction around 2025.
It really is. And the consistent takeaway across these diverse sources, despite their different focuses, is pretty stark. They generally conclude that the people currently in positions of power, regardless of political party, are unlikely to be the ones who will fundamentally fix this converging mess. Yeah, either because they're too constrained by the polarized political environment, or in some cases argued by the sources, because they might actually benefit from aspects of the current system's dysfunction. So the call to action presented shifts quite dramatically. It falls squarely onto citizens, onto you, the listener, to act collectively, potentially bypassing or reforming the existing structures.
Okay, so if waiting for traditional politics isn't the answer, according to these analyses, what specific actionable things do they suggest people can actually do to try and disrupt these negative cycles?
The proposed tactics generally fall into two main buckets: political disruption and economic disruption, often starting at the local level. For political disruption, the emphasis is surprisingly local and also digital. It means things like running for those often overlooked hyper-local offices, school boards, zoning committees, county commissions, city councils, places where decisions directly impact communities but often fly under the radar. And relatedly, supporting candidates, especially at local and state levels, who explicitly refuse corporate donations. But critically, because those candidates usually can't afford expensive TV ads or traditional campaigning, the sources stress the need for citizens to become amplifiers. That means actively subscribing to their newsletters, liking their social media posts, sharing their videos and content. The idea is to use algorithms and networks to build visibility and momentum without relying on corporate media gatekeepers or funding.
Okay, so direct political action, but maybe focused differently. What about the economic side, using our wallets or financial choices?
Yes. The economic disruption angle focuses on using collective consumer and financial power to essentially starve the systems causing harm and nurture alternatives. This translates into really practical, sometimes small, daily choices. Things like consciously choosing to shop at local businesses instead of huge chains. Using cash more often where possible, partly to reduce the amount of data harvested about you. Canceling subscriptions to services seen as exploitative, or getting rid of high-interest credit cards from predatory lenders. A big one mentioned is moving your money checking, savings, investments away from the giant Wall Street banks, especially those heavily financing fossil fuels or engaging in harmful practices, and towards local credit unions or smaller ethical community banks.
So divesting personally in a way. What else?
Supporting alternative models like worker-owned cooperatives. Making conscious choices about consumption, buying used items, repairing things instead of immediately replacing them. Maybe even small acts, like growing some of your own food or supporting local farmers markets. The core idea presented is that every economic choice you make is a small vote for the kind of system you want. The goal is to consciously withdraw participation and funding from systems deemed extractive or harmful, and redirect it towards building something better, even if it starts small.
Right. Which brings us, I think, to the final, quite provocative thought that emerged from synthesizing these sources, a direct challenge to the listener, to you.
It is a challenge. Given everything we've discussed, the severity and the simultaneous nature of these financial, environmental, and political crises, the sources essentially pose this question. Is it enough to simply criticize the system to point out the problems while still passively participating in the very structures that cause the harm? The suggestion is that passive participation, in the face of such clear warnings, might border on complicity. So the ultimate challenge left for you, the listener, and really for all of us as citizens, is to ask, what is the one small, maybe uncomfortable action I am willing to take today? Whether it's political, economic, or in my community, what step am I willing to take now to help nudge us away from what the sources paint as a deeply uncomfortable, potentially catastrophic future?
A powerful question indeed, something definitely to mull over after absorbing all this information. Thank you for helping us navigate the depth and complexity of these critical sources today.
It was essential work. Synthesizing these warnings and laying out the potential paths forward, as presented in the material, is crucial for informed decision-making.
We certainly hope you, our listener, found this deep dive into systemic risk valuable. If you did, please do consider subscribing to VSOW. Maybe leave a like or drop a comment. It really does help support the work we do in bringing future deep dives like this one to you and helps others find this information.
Yes, your engagement truly fuels our ability to continue this exploration of complex sources.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.